API reviews. We're going to just address a little bit of the backlog, including starting with reviewing an issue that we sent back before with questions. So we're going to start with 34648, the proposal for Git GC info. And I have no idea how to start this. Because I don't know about any of you, but I haven't read Mayone's answers yet.
Do you want to take a few minutes to read them first, then?
Oh, hello, Mayone.
Hi.
Okay, so I know so for how does it relate to GC memory info, I think part of our question was, are we obsoleting it?
I'm fine. I mean, I think this is the part where you guys tell me what the convention is. You know, is in this situation, like, do we obsolete that API that was added not too long ago, or do we support it until some time elapses? Or I'm fine with, whatever the people normally do in this case.
Well, I guess the thing that would answer that question is if a customer were to come to you and to ask, how do I get the GC information? Would you recommend that they use the old API in certain scenarios, or is your answer just always use a new API for all cases?
I think just use a new API.
Okay.
Is there any benefit to, so from what I remember, the reason we weren't just adding to the previous one was because it was a struct and we didn't want to add a whole bunch of fields to a struct. But if we're talking about now adding a new method that returns a class, could we structure it such that we just add a single field to the thing returned from the existing API that is itself a class that contains everything else? Or is that bad for some reason?
Sorry, I didn't really get what was proposed.
Wait, the current API returns a struct with like 4 fields or something, right?
Yeah.
Could we add one field to it that is a class that contains all the other fields we want? Is there a design that makes that doesn't look bad?
I honestly, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't, like, it seems okay to me, but what?
Yeah. So would your question on that, Steve, be essentially just change it to a struct wrapping the reference type and forward all the properties?
Yeah.
I mean, seems like returning one class that just, sorry.
No, I was going to say we currently have, either way forward from here gives us a set of APIs that we're not thrilled about. Either we just added an API and we're going to deprecate it and add something new that looks very similar, or we're going to kind of massage the existing one into something that meets our needs, and some properties look like they're more important than others. I don't know which is better, but I'm wondering if we've completely explored what that might look like.
I mean, to me, this returning everything in a single class looks a bit more natural than returning a struct that has a few fields that are not necessarily more important or less important than other fields, but the other fields are returned as one class in that struct. So,
in GC generation info, are they exposed as fields or are they exposed as properties?
Is there any advantage to one over the other?
If GC generation info is currently exposing them as properties and not directly the fields, then essentially, if I understood Steve's proposal, it's make GC info a internal class, copy all of the properties onto GC generation info, and then just change it to a struct wrapping the reference type, which makes it a reference type, but without changing our public API.
They're properties.
GC generation info does not currently exist, does it?
I think you're talking about GC memory info.
Yes, sorry. I glanced at this and thought that the thing at the top was the existing API.
Those are all
part
read-only
why I'm
properties.
suggesting it, that the fact that we then have all these different things that begin with GC and end with info and are very close to each other is, I think, confusing.
Do we know why it was made a struct in the first place? Was it important to have this API not allocate when it returns the GC information to you?
I think previously it was a struct just because we didn't have many fields on it.
So it wasn't a memory savings optimization that caused us to do that.
I mean, you could say it is a memory saving, so you don't have to allocate on the heap.
Well, one question is for like total memory, like does the allocated bytes include the GC memory info that you're going to be returning, or the GC info in this case?
Allocated bytes. Are you talking about a different API?
No, like the information you're returning for.
Yeah, which one?
Is there not one that says how much memory is being used by this process?
Oh, that's different from allocated. Yeah,
Okay.
when you say allocated, there's another API that just returns allocated. Yeah, there's at the top, if you look at the top 5 fields that used to belong to GC memory info. So yeah, that does give you like how much allocated by, how many bytes are used currently by the heap and fragmentation, and yeah.
And does that include the GC info that just got created to be returned?
What do you mean? Does that include the GC info that just got created?
This
You
class.
mean like if we have to allocate an object to hold this, does the number here include that the bytes that just got allocated to that object?
Right.
No. This is all just based on last GC.
Right. So, yeah, since GC memory info does have everything exposed as properties instead of fields, I think we could eliminate the new method and just expand the struct as just being a complicated wrapper around a reference. So just the new version would have more data.
Yeah, that's my vote as well, unless there's some really good reason we need to avoid the allocation from this API.
I mean, there's an array in there. Can you do a struct?
If
So-
that were a span instead of an array, it does not have to be an extra allocation.
Okay.
Since the existing memory info struct doesn't expose any public fields, couldn't we just have an internal class that has all this info, and then the only field of GC memory info is the reference to that class? That way it's under
Yeah,
24 bytes.
That's the proposal.
Okay.
Yeah, the entire structure just fits in a single register now.
Yeah. And then all the property accessors get complicated because they'll have to, if the reference value is null, return 0, so that default doesn't go from not throwing to throwing, if we care. We probably care.
Do you mind just writing it down, like what exactly you mean? Because, I'm not familiar with sometimes when you talk about like what, yeah.
Essentially that.
And GC info in this case is still a reference type?
Yeah, internal class GC info.
Okay,
It's the type that you had
does
proposed here.
how does this save? Like, what is the purpose of doing it this way?
We don't introduce new public types, and we don't say that the existing method no longer serves any purpose. The existing method's still the method you call. It just gets more information now. So every property on
from a
GC
consumption
info.
perspective, yeah, from a consumption perspective, it's just adding new APIs to the existing type.
Yeah.
But this is a different class. Like, is
No,
this
it's no, forget the existing proposal.
okay?
Just take all the members that you added into the new type and put them onto the existing one.
Okay.
I
With
turned off docking.
so, okay, I see. Seems strange to me, but what do I know?
Why is it strange?
I mean, originally it's just a struct, and like there's these 5 fields on it, but now you're calling the same API, but it just gets back totally different things.
Well, you're not. You're still getting back a struct. It still has all the properties on it that it had before. Now it just has additional properties.
Yeah, because since it wasn't exposed as fields, nobody has any knowledge of what the actual backing data on this was. It could have always been a wrapped reference. They'll just be slightly slower now, but in the you had to go through a dereference and a null check instead of you're just reading an offset.
It's also a technically breaking change because the existing struct qualifies as unmanaged and is usable for interop and other cases, but considering how new it is, I doubt that's a concern.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And arguably obsoleting the existing one is also a breaking change.
And having
Not a
two is
runtime
ugly.
breaking change.
What's that?
How is obsoleting a type is not a breaking? Well, it's a source breaking change, but not a runtime breaking change,
No,
right?
source breaking change.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the point of it breaking the sort of blittableness is fair, but given that it doesn't have a documented or guaranteed consistent field layout, using it in a p invoke would be unwise anyway.
So,
Well,
Tanner, you might know the answer to this. So, if I had a span of stack alloc GC info and compiled it against .NET 3.1, and then I take that DLL and run it against .NET 5, what happens?
I'm not sure because the JIT actually allows pointers to reference types. So I'm not quite sure what behavior the JIT would have if it encountered a stack alloc or attempting to pass a pointer to this, and at runtime it happens to contain a reference. That'd probably be a question for Aaron and maybe Maoni.
By the way, I just searched, and that get memory info is documented on MSDN. I don't know if that matters for anything. Or docs.microsoft.com.
Is it documented as being blittable and safe to use in a p invoke? And if it's just simply documented,
I'm
that's
not sure. I'm not sure if that kind of info is ever in our API documentation.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about that unless a struct is clearly documented as being for p invoke. I would assume that it's not intended to be used as such.
So making this a field of the previous struct, what benefit does this give us, just so that you can call the same API?
so we don't have two methods sitting right next to each other that do almost the same thing, but with one of them returns a superset of data than the other one.
Especially when we just shipped the previous API in the last release.
Yeah.
I mean, if we just shipped an API and it's wrong, I don't necessarily feel bad about backing it out.
Right, but if GC memory info had already been a class, there would be no question here. We would just be adding to it. And
yeah.
So I think that the right answer is pretend it was a class all along and do it with a struct wrapper.
Also a good example of why we shouldn't be so quick to introduce new struct types in the framework.
Well, this struct type went through an API review like we're doing now.
Yeah.
I feel like one of the
Um,
questions we probably would have asked is, do we see that, or do we expect it to grow? And presumably the answer was no, but maybe we forgot to ask the question.
Yeah.
I don't think that was asked. And I'm pretty sure if somebody asked me that, I would have said yes.
Sure. So it's just something we missed then. Okay.
Okay. So I have that big note. Now I understand all the juggling Emo does. All right. So, would you like to take over for your questions, Emo? Guess not. All right. So
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Because I didn't actually put this in the proposal, which I probably should, but I can ask it now. So that you see that generation info, is there any way that you prefer to, it's at the bottom, it says GC generation info. So that would have right. So like that would have, like if we were shipping this API last release, that would have 4 elements, right? But since we're shipping this release, this has 5 elements. And in the future, it might have more. So it's not a fixed number of elements. So is there any way that you prefer to give this information to the user, or the user just calls like geninfo.length and just iterate through them?
Oh, so the array.
Yeah, like I mean, the way that I envision that if I were a user of this API, I would just say like do a for loop to iterate through the dot length number of elements. But I don't know if there's like some sort of convention that you expect users to use this kind of information like in an array that is not necessarily a fixed number of elements.
But just to confirm, for any given GC info,
yeah,
the size of the array will be the same throughout the lifetime of the application.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
And does that mean I should like maybe expose that length as a member, or it's fine to just let the user iterate through the length?
To me, the length seems sufficient.
Okay, that's good. That's what I thought.
Yeah. Presumably this array is captured on each snapshot, correct?
On each GC, yes.
Okay.
So
there's not like a static singleton array that's being updated under the covers.
Right, because we don't want, I mean, at least when we give this array to the user, it would be a new array, so it doesn't change. Like, I think it would be very odd, like, if I get a hold of an array, but then after I read the value, then at some point it just changes. That seems very odd.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
So
I think that's something that we discussed in the comment section, right?
Right.
I think the one question we had last time is, should it be something else in an array? But I think if this is snapshot semantics and you basically don't recycle it, I think exposing a raw array might be okay.
But so when does the array get created? Is it created on the property read, or is it created at the snapshot? Or sorry, at the call to the method?
So I'm thinking, because I thought this was kind of an implementation detail, so I didn't really give it all that much thought. But I would think we just make probably we have an array that, GC obviously wouldn't create anything new. We just like inside GC, we just have one big, struct or whatever that we fill in at the end of each GC. And then as far as how this info gets delivered to the BCL side, I'm thinking you just, create a new class in the BCL and then make an F call and get that filled in. Something like that.
Right. So I guess the difference would be Because if the pause durations array, for example, was implemented as the getter is returning a copy of the, the collection 97 data, then that means that the getter is returning a new array. So if someone writes a for loop, that's actually an n-squared operation. And so the getter can't return a new array, so we sort of discourage properties returning arrays because now it's ambiguous. So either a method to encourage someone to cache it locally before they loop over it, or if we want to say it makes more sense as a property, but we're promising that we took it as a snapshot, and if you mutate the one that you get back, then yeah, it's mutated. Don't mess with the GC info data. But
Well, the one thing you
it
could
shouldn't
do is
cross-contaminate calls.
yeah, the
Well,
one thing you so the
yeah,
one
go
thing you
ahead.
could do is making it lazy, right? I mean, you could say we don't allocate it eagerly because maybe some people who call this class only care about the bools or the longs we expose here, and then you only allocate the array when somebody actually pulls on the property from pause durations or gen info, right?
Right.
And then you
memorize
that
it.
wouldn't really work because if you ask for this info, it kind of needs to be filled in at the same time because you can't
right.
really, like you want to get consistent info for one GC, right? If you
Right.
go ask the VM side again, it might already be onto the next GC, so you get like.
I see.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you, as an example, had an implementation that was, you built as long as the index hasn't changed, you're using the same
Right.
object and calling clone on it, then the clone of that object would need to, or you should copy the arrays, but now it's built for the object when somebody gets it back. Or you could make the cloned objects do a lazy copy, as long as they memoize it and don't return it as a new one every property get.
Yeah.
But
Right.
two different calls to get memory info, or whatever the method is, should see two different arrays by reference.
Why not return it as a span? A read-only span, like to explicitly tell the caller you are not intended to modify this.
I mean,
And if they need to make a copy of it, call .toArray.
Right.
Yeah, could do that. Yeah, I don't see a problem. I think the main thing I care about is, you don't have like a torn state, right? You don't get like some of the fields or properties as for
Right.
one GC and some for the other. As long as we can guarantee that, it's fine.
I mean, the question is, what's the benefit of using, let's say, span or read-only span over exposing the array?
So this is kind of a big class. I mean, if there's a way to save the allocation, that's goodness, right?
Yeah, one of the benefits of using span is these arrays are only updated when a GC occurs, correct?
Right.
So you could literally cache all of the values between GCs, and every time someone calls this method saying "get me the data," you return a span pointing to the data that you've already cached. So everyone actually gets the exact same span until a GC occurs.
Right. That sounds like a good idea to me.
Yeah, if we can do that, that makes sense. Like the way I understood Maoni's comment was that we can't do that because the runtime will update them whenever they see fit. And if you already gave out a reference to that, then GC happens at the time customer code runs inspecting the GC info, you might actually change the values the customer is looking at.
You wouldn't be able to point the span at the shared singleton maintained by the GC. You'd have to point the span at a data structure that's created within the runtime between GCs. But that data structure only has to be created once between GCs.
Yeah. So if something like
I see.
a call to get memory info happens and it sees that the index is not equal to the last index, that it says new GC info, and then that builds the array and just returns the span. Since there's no caller management and we're not going to be updating it in the background, and we promise we'll never ever update it in the background, then returning read-only span would be similar to what we did in encoding.
Yeah.
So even though I hate span properties, I think I can be comfortable with that one.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of it either, but we also don't have a read-only array, right? So I think that's the best we can do.
Jeremy, why do you hate span properties?
Because especially if you end up returning a span over internal data, like an array that's stored in a field, then it massively limits what the implementation can do. But if it's just a snapshot return API, then there would never be any further writes to it. So it's less bad.
I see.
Yeah.
But we get it on when people want growable writers of like, oh, give me a span of what it wrote. It's like, well, if you save the span and call write again and it grows, that span is now, where's it pointing? If it was pullbacked, then now you have a memory exposure bug. So.
Yeah, but again, for APIs like this, where we guarantee the data is immutable once it's created, I don't think there's a huge problem.
Yeah.
So are we doing a span on this, or what?
You should do read-only span, I think.
Read-only span. Okay.
Yeah. And again, if you need a copy, .to array.
Okay.
If the caller needs a copy, you mean, right, Levi?
Yeah. If the caller needs to make a copy for some reason.
Yeah, and then so because we've now made this a reference type and such, which was already being done for the GC info, that does allow the optimization of when you call it, you've saved just the singleton create, and it doesn't you don't actually build a new one until the index changes. So that will save on allocations. All right, what other questions do we have? Yeah, so index is how many times the garbage collector has run.
Yes.
Does that have meaning across
process,
threads?
right?
What? Sorry, two people are talking at the same time.
So that's, is it within the process or is it for the thread that asked the question?
Within the process.
So if I understand correctly, background GC runs per thread. So does that, like, what state is the API in when that's happening?
What do you mean runs per thread?
I thought
it runs
like generation 0 was thread affinitized or something.
You're probably thinking like server GC affinitized, but anyway, that's so if a background GC is still in progress while you're calling this API, because background GC mostly runs concurrently when the user threads run, you will not get the background info just yet. This info would only be filled in when at the end of a GC. Okay,
and in server GC, it still is a unique value. You wouldn't see two different snapshots for index 25, for example.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, we only update that index and the related info at the end of that background GC. So what you would see is actually you might see an index that's not since this is an API that you call, you could very, very well call it and get an index that's quite a bit larger than the last time you called. But let's say you call this often enough, more often than the GC intervals. So you might see something like 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 7 for the next index, because number 6 is in a background GC. So it wouldn't be there until a bit later. But I don't think that's not a problem.
Okay.
So basically, it's the idea every time I query this API, I get whatever the latest GC is, right?
Exactly. Whatever the latest GC that ended.
Right. So that means I could see, let's say, index 1, and then as the next one I see it happens to be index 4, and then index 6, and the ones in between, I just were unlucky I couldn't observe them, and there's no way for me to get access to that, right?
Right. I mean, it's the same as perf counters, right? Which is used very extensively. So perf counters, there's no, it's completely based on how often you sample. You could get a GC, next time you call, like, number of Gen 0 collection count, it could be way larger than the last time you called.
But that now also means if the caller is actually stashing away the entire GC info, then if we basically recycle the arrays that the thing is point to, then reading the actual classes no longer makes sense, right?
You mean like if we were to return a span, or?
Yeah, because people cannot snapshot the span, but they can snapshot the entire type, right?
Yeah, but we're not talking about recycling that data.
No, I'm confused. I thought we said we would.
No, we could create a cached copy of the data between GCs, and every time someone calls this API. So actually, let me back up a little bit. Mayoni, if two different threads call this API at approximately the same time, this is kind of a rephrasing of Jeremy's question, they'd get back effectively the exact same data, right?
Right.
So
assuming a GC hasn't happened, yeah.
Yeah, so quite literally then, what we could do is we could build up the entire structure the first time someone calls this for any given GC index, and then assuming that the GC index hasn't changed between subsequent calls, we literally just hand that same structure right back to the caller. And then once a GC happens, we throw our cache structure out in its entirety, and then we lazily create it the next time someone calls this API. So that, yeah, that would work, because when we lazily recreate it, we also lazily recreate all of the arrays and everything else.
So that means if somebody queries this API periodically and takes the end result and adds it to some sort of list, for example, and then at some other time they iterate over the list and do something, they get still sensible answers.
I would hope.
I thought
Okay,
if they want to stash it away, they would have to call to array on it.
Well,
No,
that's
two
only the
arrays
case.
if they want to make a mutable copy.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
I mean, the span type forces them, they can't stash away the span, right? But the problem is the whole GC info is a class, right? So they can, of course, stash up the entire GC info. Right, so that's why I'm asking. But that seems fine. As long as you make sure that we get sensible answers there, that seems so reasonable.
I mean, obviously, are we talking about now allowing the user to stash away a copy of the GC info that could potentially mutate or not?
No, we are talking about, so basically there's two things here, right? So if we make the arrays that are currently on GC info, if we make them spans, then the user cannot easily stash away those arrays directly, right? Because they're spans, so you can't put them anywhere really fully. The other thing we can do is we can make them read-only, so the person doesn't get to modify them, because if they're arrays, they could just write into them if they wanted to, which would be weird, but they could, right? So moving to read-only span, you basically eliminate these two things. But the caller can, of course, already take the entire GC info thing and stores it in a static list somewhere, right? There's nothing preventing them from doing that. So I was just asking because it sounded like what we said earlier is we want to move to span so that we can recycle parts of the arrays. But it sounds like the way we do the recycling is basically between GCs, which means two different people basically asking for the same GC info for the same GC would see the same data. Each of them would see, their own view effectively for the span. But if they both stash away the GC info instance, that's fine, because next time a GC happens, there's a new array created that, the next caller will get out. But there's nothing wrong with exposing that, and that seems fine. So I just want to make sure that if people do something that is fairly naive, which is, just stashing this thing in a list, you still want to have self-consistent.
Yeah, what Jeremy has on the screen, basically. Like once you get one of those objects back, it and all of the data that it points to is absolutely guaranteed immutable.
Right.
Yeah. There's a question from the chat asking why we picked read-only span instead of read-only memory, given that it's array-backed.
It doesn't have to be array-backed.
Right.
You could include the data in line as fields within the object. That saves the allocations.
We could.
Yeah. How unusable is span inside an async keyword method?
It's very usable once you call .toArray on it.
Well, I mean, like, there really isn't a
I guess
problem
memory you just have
right?
to then turn it into .span anyway before you can use it, because we intentionally left out an indexer. So.
Memory you can also access if you want to. You can extract the array from underneath it. So if we were concerned about multiple callers being able to get access to the array, you can do that with memory, but not with span. At least
that's fair. Okay, so yeah, so read-only span would be the right answer.
But even then, I mean, like, I think even if you called, GC info from an async method, even if the compiler has to hoist the locals, it would hoist the reference to the GC info, right? Which is fine, right? Only if you actually assign a local variable, one of those arrays, you would have any issues to begin with, right? So I don't think that using read-only span in this type would make those scenarios less usable.
No, it's you're right. It's only when the
public,
span
yes.
needs to survive across the 08 that anything cares.
And
well,
you have to have it in
not,
the local.
unfortunately, that's not 100% true. The C# compiler today doesn't basically just says you can't create locals of type span inside async methods,
Right.
regardless of whether they may or may not survive across an await. It would be nice if they did, if the compiler did, but it doesn't currently.
Okay.
Because they just build one giant class state machine that stores all the locals, and so now you have a span that's being saved as a field to a class, and it says it can't do that.
Right.
Okay, so
I had another question on index from something Mayoni said before. Like, will it over time? Will it ever go down?
No. Well, I mean, over time it will not go down. But as I mentioned, if you just make consecutive calls, you may not get an index that strictly goes up.
You might get
right?
the same
You
index.
get one
basically.
index, and then next time you call it, you get an index that's smaller. But if you look at the global trend, it would keep going up.
But from if I make the call at time n and at time n+1, I will never get a lower value at time n+1.
You might get a lower value.
Would it make more sense to call because it's an index of when the GC started and not
No,
when it
it's
stopped?
index when. Well, yes, right. When we start a GC, it gets assigned an index, but this only gets updated when a GC ends.
server GC starts numbers 10 and 11 in parallel, 11 finishes, 10 finishes.
Oh.
Yeah, they can't really start in parallel, but you could have a background GC happen and then a bunch of foreground GCs happen that end before that background GC ends.
Okay, that seems hard to understand, but yes.
So
Would
the
it make
index.
sense calling it an identifier or an ID instead of an index?
I don't think this is just an index. You should not use it as some kind of anything more than that.
So it's
an index into what though? Right? Like for an identifier makes kind of more sense. It's like this is the ID of this collection.
It's an index into, as more GCs happen, another GC happens, we give it an index.
I think Eric's question is, normally when you talk about an index, it is an index into something. Like you have an index into an array, so you can look up something in the array. But here you're giving an index, but there's nothing that you pass it to.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, really,
So
it's can we come up with a better name of index, which is
Right, it's just a naming question is all I'm kind of asking about, yeah.
Yeah, I think to me, index kind of the other thing is like, I think the naive view people would have by reading the docs is that the number only goes up, right? So if you just say, well, the index really just represents the data that this, basically some value that indicates which GC this data was actually associated with, right? Then I think index is a bit of a weird term. I mean, ID I actually kind of like, because it kind of doesn't make ordering guarantees. It just means it's unique.
Yeah, I
Which would
just
be
use
the case.
index because in GC we call this an index, but
Yeah, the problem is really like if you call it an index, usually I guess I don't know what the runtime does with it, but usually you use it to index into something, right? And maybe the data structures you use to index into you just don't expose, right?
yeah, I think index is more just for diagnostic purpose. Like we don't actually index into anything.
Yeah, I think ID would be a good name. It's
Okay.
you can compare to that this is different than the previous GC info or GC memory info that you got because it has a different ID, and its whole purpose is not equal.
Right.
Or equal.
Yeah, I guess that's a better way to describe it, right? Index kind of assumes I can order them, right? I can do less than or greater than comparisons versus with ID, you usually don't expect to make those. You usually just do equals or not, equals or not equals, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Are they orderable?
What do you mean exactly?
So we're saying that the index is intended to be effectively an opaque identifier. So if I get index 10 and 11 back, the fact that one is one larger than the other really has no meaning?
Not when background GC is in the picture.
Okay.
Which is the default now, right?
Yes, it's been for the past quite a few years.
Sure. Because I'm off the wall thing. I'm just wondering if the ID should be object instead of int, and like it's literally we new object, and they either have reference identity or they don't. But
But then you always got to allocate it, right?
Yeah,
it could point back to itself.
Well, so I would expect people who use this are generally the people who are very used to, looking at something like, per view, the GC stats view, so they know what an index is of an GC.
Okay, so that's a different argument. I think that's more compelling, right? If I use WinDBG, sorry, not WinDBG, if I use the Purview, for example, and I try to correlate information that Purview gives me with something I collected in my application, then aligning those names makes sense to me, because otherwise it's super confusing, right? But so if you already expose the terminology index in tools and other places, and people have to deal with that, then
yeah.
I'm almost in favor of keeping the name here, because that it makes it easier for people. Otherwise, we have two different terms. We expect people to both know and know they're the same. That seems to make things worse.
Agreed.
Right.
Seems legit.
Okay.
Because that also kind of means then, especially when you look at Purview, you kind of have to, I guess, understand already how these things relate to each other in terms of time, right? And if it's complicated, then that's unfortunate, but that's the reality.
How is the index exposed through Purview? 32-bit integer, 64-bit integer smuggled through a GUID?
It's a 64-bit integer.
Okay. So just as long as we're using the same data type and the same name here then?
Yeah. I mean, I basically just, like the way I called a lot of these things are the same. That's what we're used to, yeah. That's why I had that double data type, which I think was Steve who suggested, or someone else suggested to change to time span, because in Purview we always use double for all time-related things.
What does the double represent normally?
A time.
What time? But like what unit?
Time and like in Purview, there's a lot of places that we say like something as megs. So that obviously could be a fraction. So we always use double for that.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I mean, I don't. I think if I paste this, it would look very odd in the chat window. But in Purview, if you look at the GC stats, which is what many people do, it's just called, the first column is just called GC index. So that's a number that this API will be returning as the index.
Luckily, Purview is open source, and we can change that.
Yeah. The chat suggested combining them with index ID or GC index ID, but I don't know that really buys us a lot. So
I think index ID sounds a little odd to me.
Yeah. So index is probably the best name given the tooling.
Okay.
Yeah.
And maybe just throw into the docs that some at least parts of this discussion, right, of describing what it is. It's basically the identity of the collection.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We can definitely do that.
Non-monotonic should only be used for comparison with Purview results / not equal to an existing value, or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So finalize object count. Is that things that are finalization pending?
Yes, it's ready. I mean, the correct term for this is these are the objects are ready for finalization.
Right.
Which is why I insisted. Like this was actually the one place I said to not call it finalizable object, because finalizable object means something very specific.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Very different from ready for finalization.
So things in the queue, is that what this represents?
Well, so okay, so there's a queue. whenever you allocate an object that's finalizable, it gets added to some part in that queue. And then when we do a GC, we discover that some of these objects are dead. We'll move it to another part in this queue, and that's the ready for finalization part.
Okay.
So this count that we're given out is how many objects are ready for finalization, meaning that as soon as GC is over, the finalizer will be, at least will attempt to run the finalizers on these objects.
Right. So yeah, because the word pending exists in my head, I don't know if we use it anywhere, but finalization pending, or even just finalization queue count.
You might be thinking about the API that's called wait for pending finalizers, right? So there is such an API, and that does mean the same thing. But so the terms related to finalization, because I think Jan was the one who said, "Oh, is this the same as what we expose in the perf counters?" So if so, we should use that, and I do agree with that. But when it comes to finalization, we do have different terms. Like, and if you use WinDBG, use the SOS debugger extension, it does say ready for finalization. So, like, which one do we use? I think ready for finalization sounds kind of long to me. So I was okay with the same term we used in the perf counters, even though that term is, it can be kind of ambiguous, but we can definitely make it clear in the talk that what this means.
Yeah. Well, that's why I'm suggesting finalization pending or finalization queue count, because those both to me feel more like they're talking about. I mean, I know that understand that the implementation is that the queue even contains things that aren't ready, but conceptually you can think of it as the GC moves a thing into the finalization queue, and so I don't. While that may be glossing over some details, I think it conveys the semantics still with a shortish name.
Like finalization pending count.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, like, you were basically iterating or saying like how important it is to differentiate it from finalizable, and I think the character difference between these two words is so little that I don't think people would pick up that nuance from just looking at finalized object count. I think most people would probably have the same conclusion we had, which is somebody was not didn't feel like typing out the word finalizable or something, but they would probably assume it's the same thing. So throwing in another term somewhere seems useful to just make that clear.
Okay, I'm fine with that.
All right, so I wrote down finalization pending count.
Okay.
Works for me.
Right, so in GC generation info, for one, should those be properties instead of fields? And for two, is it worth putting an identifier in it so that somebody can remember, oh, this was the Gen 3 info, instead of remembering that they got it from GC memory info.generations sub 3 or 2, I guess, or whatever. So is the extra number valuable to someone, and should these be properties instead of fields?
The properties, yes, definitely.
I mean, so do I get this right that effectively gen info, like this array would only ever have 3 elements in our world because we only have...
No, it may have more.
Apparently we're up to 5 now.
It already has more, yeah.
Okay.
And it may change in the future. So that's what maybe this was talked about before you joined. So I said, this is not a fixed number of element array.
It's, the length of, hold on, I can highlight it. This array, or span, will never change during the lifetime of the process, but is not necessarily the 3 that you think of.
Exactly. Yeah.
I see. So, so does it mean we have more than 3 generations now, or is it not the same as generations?
So, logically, we only have 3 generations because there's some generations that only get collected within 1 generation. But physically, we do have more than 3 generations.
What this is exposing is the physical?
Yes. Yes.
So is this making a distinction between Gen 3 collect and Gen 3 large object heap?
Right. I mean, this would, so Gen 3 physically is, large object heap physically is Gen 3 in GC, right? But it gets collected in Gen 2 GCs because we don't have, when you look at the collection generation, there's nothing that's more than 2, right? It's just 0, 1, 2. But internally, physically, large object heap is represented as generation 3. So this will return as generation 3 in the array, right? So if you iterate through this array starting from 0, you get Gen 0 info, Gen 1 info, Gen 2 info, Gen 3 info. Now we have a Gen 4 info.
So digesting that and going back to your question, Jeremy, I can imagine maybe adding an int member to this saying what logical generation am I? If per Mayoni, these are intended to represent physical generations, but I don't know if that information is really useful to people. Did that correctly summarize what you had said, Mayoni?
So I think, again, we have to consider the users of this API. So I believe the users of this API, they do understand, it would be very easy to make them understand, when I iterate through this array, when I get to Gen 2 info, and then I look at the next, Gen 3, and I know that they're collected during Gen 2 GC. I'm not sure if it's necessary to expose that they're collected in a Gen 2 GC in this API, because I feel like that's just something that we should explain in the documentation. And there might be, in the future, we might decide some of those are not collected with Gen 2. So
right. I guess part of the question is, are they, so as somebody who understands a little bit of how garbage collectors work, I know that if I hold on to a reference longer than I needed to, that something can slip from Gen 0 into Gen 2, and
Yep.
that if I somehow was tracking that, I could trace back to, oh, I should have dropped the reference here, and that would have made things go better, which generally means hierarchically, things that get freed in later generations may be a problem of they should have been freed sooner. Is this array hierarchical? Like, is the last thing in the array always representing things that were held on longer than the previous ones? Ignoring
So
things
that's
like
what I'm
allocate an
saying,
array
right?
into late generations.
Because this array gives you the physical representation of generations, it means that it's not like if I look at the if I look at the fourth element in the array, I know that the objects that get collected there are not, collected later than if I look at the third element in the array. That's not necessarily the case, because some of the elements in this array might get collected in the same generation.
Okay. And then does perf view make or expose that data, or does all the stuff get lumped into like Gen 2?
You can definitely get to the physical representations of generations, which means in perf view you'll see like Gen 0, Gen 1, Gen 2, and then we just call it large object or large generation or generation large, something like that. So you do get more than 3.
Right, and that was the premise of my question earlier. If we were to add an identifier on GC generation info, would it say literally like generation large or something like that?
Like, could we add the string in the GC generation info so that you can match it to perf view?
We could. I mean, we could maybe expose some kind of enum in this that says, 0 is 0, 1 is 1, 2 is 2, but 3 is large object generation, and 4 is pinned object generation, something like that. I don't know if that's necessary, but if you want like a more meaningful mapping, then or more similar to what Perfuse exposes today.
Yeah, and if you're saying that you don't think our audience would find it very useful, like I would probably defer to your expertise on that, honestly.
I think our audience probably just know the relationship from using other perf tools. Like today, if you look at Perfuse, it tells you like that very wide table in GC stats. It tells the info on Gen 0, 1, 2, and then it says large object heap. So, you know, people who are used to looking at that table, they would know like, okay, when I iterate through this array and I do 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I know that how those correspond to what I see in that GC status table.
So is this intended to only be used in concert with tooling? Is it possible that I could write an application that uses just this API and be sure that I'm interpreting this array properly when .NET 6 comes out?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, if all you want is the GC info, you could totally just call this API without any other tooling thing. I mean, obviously, if you want to do more perf analysis, like you might want other, but if all you need is GC info, you can call this API. You don't have to use it in conjunction with other tools.
And I could reason about what the GC generation info array is trying to tell me. Horribly, like future-proof.
Sorry, you're very quiet.
Sorry, my mic was turned down. So if I write an application for .NET 5 and I'm interpreting this gen info array, and I upgrade to .NET 6, will the way I'm interpreting the array still be valid if we add or change the way the physical representation is internally?
So all the elements that you're already getting will be valid, yes. So let's say in .NET 6, we add yet another physical generation. It would come later than the existing ones.
Okay, so we would never remove a physical generation.
I don't think so. Yeah. I mean, what the physical generation, how it's handled might change, but we just keep. I mean, all we do is just add another number, so there's no point for us to change the existing numbers. So let's say if somebody called this API in .NET 5 and he knows that the length of this array is 5 today, and obviously if we were to add another physical generation in .NET 6 and then he looked at the length again, he wouldn't get 6, right? But if he remembered from .NET 5 there's 5 elements, and if he was to look at the first 5 elements, and those would still be valid.
Okay. I think so long as we're never planning on adding like a GC 1.5.
I mean, these are just numbers, so they're integer numbers, so we don't.
Yeah. And if that situation does arrive in the future, then we could reopen the discussion of whether there needs to be an int member on here or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also not super concerned because I really have a hard time seeing application authors doing any sort of decision making in their logic as the app is running, and then you upgrade the app between versions. I think most of it is diagnostic data that you interpret out of band effectively, right?
Right.
Like you probably take this data and dump it somewhere, right?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, depending on what you're tracking as your server metric, you may care to try printing out periodically the large object heap dump stats, but I guess you'll just have to look up in the docs and find out that means array index 3 and just keep reading that one.
It sounds to me it's more like the interpretation of the numbers might change over time, right? Like what is a good number, what's a bad number, in the same way that we evolved our understanding what is a large struct, what's a small struct, right? I mean, they're not really breaking changes, they're just evolvements of what constitutes a healthy process.
Yep.
By the way, Mayoni, everything that you've said is applicable only to the GC that ships inside the product, right? Like the GC is a pluggable component, and presumably it can change any of this.
You mean like if somebody else writes a gc.dl and have the core clr.dl loaded?
Yeah, because I thought there was an environment variable where you could change the GC.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Would that person provide the same information? They may or may not. That depends on that's a decision that they'll have to make.
Would any of these property getters fall over dead in that scenario where someone has written their own GC separate from us?
I mean, you could imagine well, that somebody never supports finalization. Like there's nothing that's finalizable. You know, it would be very rare because a lot of these are defined by the runtime itself, right? You know, if you create a finalizable object and that GC insists on not doing anything with it, that's bad, but you know, it's their GC, they can do whatever.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
But I don't think it's a problem for them to just fill in some numbers, right? You can like, let's say that GC is not concurrent. So concurrent, if you call concurrent on this class or struct, it would always return false.
Right.
So, yeah.
I guess a more interesting question is like Xamarin, I think today has a different GC, right? Because they have their own runtime, right?
Right.
So like in the time frame where we merged the runtimes, I suppose they run with the same GC then, right?
I don't think so, but I mean, Xamarin people did ask me about using RGC, but I don't think that's, I'm not sure how that went. But they can provide this info, no problem. Like there, you know, if you call this on Xamarin, it would return GC generation info that has a different number of elements.
Right.
Right.
I mean, it seems mostly like the API really doesn't, like, I think, cause a lot of problem with alternative GCs. It, as Mahoney said, right, a chunk of them might just return 0 or false, right?
Like if you have a very different GC, you can still return these, you know, pieces of info, right? That's not a problem.
But it might be worthwhile talking to the Xamarin people, just making sure that what we're exposing right now here makes sense to them as well. But
I think someone from Xamarin already commented on this issue, right? Because someone told them to look at it.
Yeah. Jeremy, can you check whether Merrick responded?
So Burrs Vlad, because I don't have the name. So Vlad responded, looks okay from a mono perspective, and then more words.
Yep.
More words. I like it. Cool. Have we talked about the name of Gen Info yet, or?
We're not. So the last two things that we have, because we are over time, are so Gen Info. We suggested generations. Mahoney countered with generation info.
That seems fine to me too.
It feels like it should be plural because it's returning an array.
Yeah.
Infos makes a kitten dies somewhere, but
that's fair. Info is a collective noun, I guess, or a mass noun, or whichever one of those things it is. So.
Yeah, my English teacher always beat me up when I pluralized information, so I stopped doing that.
Is generation info, should it still start with the lowercase g or
it should definitely not start with a lowercase letter.
Okay.
Our capitalization rules are very simple. That's why there are 3 pages in the book to discuss them. Yes, I think that seems fine then.
Okay.
What
was the other thing that we talked about, Jeremy?
So the last thing is pause time percentage. Because we had the question of we don't understand how to interpret the number, and then so Mahoney says it's collective for the percentage at. So if I guess let's see if I understand what Mahoney wrote. I believe it is as of the time this collection finished the total percentage of process lifetime that has been spent in the GC.
Right. So this is one of the places that are debatable, I think. I can tell you why I wanted this way, because originally in perf counters, you know, a lot of this is to essentially you get better perf counters. So one of the biggest problems with perf counters was that because perf counters are completely subject to how often you sample them, right? So you could get a perf counter that says percent time in GC that's very, very high because you happen to just have done in an expensive GC, right? So let's say you just did a Gen 2 block in GC, you could have easily gotten this counter that says like 99%, So if you don't sample often enough, you'll be keeping that 99% for however long that you sample the next time. So this is very, this is kind of misleading to people because they would think like, oh, for the last, like some people, they only sample this like once per minute, right? They sample all the counters. They can't really afford to sample too many too often. So they would get a counter that says percent time GC is 99%, and then they would just keep that for the duration of the sampling interval. So that's why I want to take this opportunity to make this the actual percent time in GC since the CLR is loaded or whenever like GC starts to count time. So that gives you a much more accurate picture of the actual percent time in GC in the process.
Right. And for server GC, does it count time as times the number of independent threads running garbage collection?
So this is actually the pause time. This is not.
So this is the full pause time.
Right. This is, we count pause time as just kind of an elapsed time. So if your process has been running, let's say for 10 seconds, and there has been 100 milliseconds total in the GC pause, we just, report a number that's 100 milliseconds divided by 10 seconds. We don't count CPU time because there's no cheap way for us to get the CPU time programmatically. Also, a lot of people, they care about the percent pause time, more than the CPU time anyway. Maybe we should, oh yeah, I do have it as pause time percentage.
So I don't know that I can come up with a better name for it, but I think that I'd have to read docs to understand it.
Yeah, in purview terms, this is exposed as percent pause time in GC.
Yeah, this name seems okay, honestly. These are all going to have to be docked anyway, clearly.
Yep.
Yeah, I think half the wages are not the ones where you can just immediately know what it does. Yeah. But that seems also fine. I mean, as long as we can, explain what it does and the name does not highly mislead people, I think it's fine.
Yeah, and I think, Meoni, your explanation here was excellent. Like, what we need to do is, like, take this and just put that little snippet in MSDN and say, like, listen to this. It explains everything.
Yeah, this is the only one thing that I really wanted to be different from the counters. In general, I wanted to expose the same kind of info as we did in perf counters because I know that a lot of people wanted this. But this is the one thing that I think like we should definitely fix this because the way that perf counters exposed it just caused a lot of problems.
Just out of morbid curiosity, is there any desire to make any of these properties static so that you can just easily get the one property that you care about as opposed to getting this entire property back? Like, is there a need to elevate the pause time percentage to be its own first-class citizen, kind of separate from this struct?
So I think this comes back to how do you get info that's consistent within one GC? Like, if there's a way to do that, but break this apart, then that's totally fine with me. But the reason why I have them all in one class or structure is because I want the user to get the consistent info for that one GC index that they're getting.
No,
right?
That's a great
elevated this, like, how do you correlate like this because as soon as you manage calls, a GC can happen. Mm-hmm. Right? How do you correlate this to another field on this class that says I belong to the same GC, right?
Sure, and that's fair. The reason I had asked is, you went into detail about how important this particular property was, and that's what made me wonder, like, should it be elevated? But if the answer is it really needs to be taken in context with everything else, and that's a great reason not to elevate it.
So this one field actually could be elevated because this is not like this is updated at each GC, but this doesn't have to be like, there's no problem if you just say like, I'm just getting this one, I'm just getting the pause time percentage standalone without any other info. Because, from GC to GC, it's not like this number is going to change all that much. Right, because it's a running thing. It's, you can't really change a whole lot.
After like the first 30 seconds.
Right, yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, having that available as a static, but also as the snapshot, so that when you say, when I write down, this was my total memory, and this is how much time thus far, asterisk, I'd spent in the GC. So it seems reasonable to have it here. It also seems reasonable to have it as a static somewhere else.
On GC?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's less about, like, you may want it to be consistent, but I can see that you could also want it without caring about the consistency. That it seems more interesting than asking about the finalizable object count. Because if you ask for that one, then you probably are also going to care what the memory percentage stuff looks like, at which point you wanted the GC snapshot and not just the one number.
Sure. And I don't really understand the scenarios enough myself to be able to make that determination. I just kind of wanted to see that discussion.
Right. But
yeah, are we proposing that this remain as a instance field, or are we proposing to change this to static, or are we proposing to add another static?
I think it makes sense. I think it makes sense to keep this as an instance member because it does make sense in the context of all the other information on the same instance. What I was asking is there a common scenario where somebody would want only that information? And if so, maybe that's justification to have another API, which is just a public static double % time in GC.
I can see somebody only wanting this one member or one field.
But again, we could also cross that bridge when we come to it, or we could do it as part of this. I don't really know.
Yeah, like I don't think we need to do it.
Experts on this.
I don't think we need to do it or need to make a static version of it now. It seems like it would make sense as a static version in addition to also staying as part of this proposal.
Yep.
Okay, I think that's the end of the questions list that we had from last time. Because there were some simple renames of is concurrent became concurrent, is etc. And
yep.
I guess one implementation question I have, since my eyes went straight to generation here, this is still bounded between it's 0, 1, or 2, right? This is the logical gen as opposed to the property or the
right.
Okay. Because this matches the gc.collect which generation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Also, I mean, this is the, internally in GC, we call this the condemned generation. So that condemned generation is only 0, 1, 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I guess I can share all of the notes that I have so far. Bing, big notes. Right. So.
Are you gonna paste this into the issue or?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
All right. So we want to not introduce new types or methods. We're just gonna use magic to expand the struct, and then we have a couple of rename things. And I think really the only one, so yeah, whether or not the GC generation info needs to expose what generation it represents as part of itself is up to you right now. There was a request for it in the chat, as opposed to somebody needing to memorize what index 4 meant. But that could be that we do an enum and then you index using the enum as well. So.
Yeah.
All right. Does anybody have anything that they cared about that I didn't write down?
No, I think this is good. Like that was all really, really great information, Maoni. Thank you so much for your time and expertise on that.
Thank you.
All right, so that covers this issue, and once again, we have failed to need to switch to that tab.
Well, at least we finally reviewed Maoni's thing. Sorry, Maoni, that it took so long. But like, I was hoping that we would done me in 20 minutes, then have 40 minutes for a backlog review, and
yeah,
I'm only an hour.
Based on my very limited API review experience, we're always taking longer than we said we would. So
yeah, I mean the devil's usually in the details, and like that's why things take longer.
Yeah.
But I'm actually happy where we landed. I don't know about everybody else, but like I like the outcome.
Yep. And so is that approved with the yes, you have to make a big structural change to collapse these two types, Emo?
Yeah, I mean that's what I usually do. I usually paste the desired API shape into the bottom, or at least the bullet points of the changes, and then just approve it, so that when people just do that, then they don't have to come back.
Okay.
Yeah, if you could like write the actual, I mean, I think I know, but if you can write it in the issue, that would be really helpful.
Yep, I'll do the merging of these types and post that as an issue and then mark it approved after eating lunch.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your lunch or whatever time frame you are in right now. Maybe dinner.